Welcome to Spotlight On, the must listen podcast series where visionary leaders, global executives, trailblazing entrepreneurs, and top tier experts come together to share their inspiring stories and tackle the hottest issues facing businesses today. Brought to you by the Barton Partnership, an award-winning global talent solution organisation, we specialise in executive search, independent consulting, and consulting solutions from strategy through to execution. Our mission? To help businesses accelerate their growth by connecting them with world-class strategy and transformation talent. Tune in and join us as we shine a spotlight on the game changers and thought leaders who are shaping the future of business. Today I'm talking to Carl Evander. Carl's the global head of OC&C's private equity practice, with a focus on advising private equity clients and their portfolio companies on strategic questions across the investment cycle. Carl is also co-lead of the firm's B2B practice in the US and serves as an elected member of the OC&C Global Board. Over the course of a 20-year-plus career in consulting and as a private equity investor, he has built deep experience working globally in complex industries where information is scarce. He has covered a range of B2B industries with a particular focus on companies in the infrastructure and construction space, along with business services, industrial services, food manufacturing, waste, and facilities management. In addition to his work at OC&C's corporate client, Carl also leads the firm's pro bono efforts in North America. He serves on the board of EL Education, a national education non-profit organisation. He's based in New York, but has previously lived and worked across the UK, Europe, Africa, and Asia. Carl, great to have you here today. You and I have known each other a long time, so I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. So thank you for joining me on this. And certainly, keen to talk about your recent trip to Superreturn. But let's start with you. Tell us about your career history to date. Tell us what led you to OC&C and tell us about your role there as well.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick. It's great to be here and looking forward to the conversation. Happy to take you through the rich tapestry that is my history. So I've been doing this for couple of decades now. I started my career back in London at Bain. That was I kind of came out of college, didn't quite know what I wanted to do with my life. Somebody said something about strategy consulting, and I thought that sounds interesting. And took to it roughly like a fish to water. I mean, maybe a saltwater fish to freshwater, but eventually I figured it out and ended up being a lifelong consultant, more or less. So I started my career at Bain in London. I was always the internationalist. I was always the guy with my hand up willing to move around. So I spent the first 8 years of my career loosely based out of London, but with long stints in South Africa, in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, and all across Europe. In 2012, that's about 8 years into my career, I made the move over to the US. Still with Bain, still doing fundamentally the type of consulting I had by that point made my specialism, it was a lot around both private equity and sort of the intersection of private equity and industrials and B2B businesses.
And this was in New York in Bain?
This was in New York at Bain, when I moved, although I had done the same thing in Europe as well. Stayed at Bain in New York for 4 to 5 years and then got that itch that we all got. I'd been someone who'd constantly been in the moves. I'd moved geography, I'd moved topics somewhat, and felt like I didn't want to be a lifelong consultant. I felt like I don't want to do this advisory thing. I want to be an owner. I want to take care of things. I'd spent a lot of my career at that point with private equity investors thinking about how they add value to businesses and thinking about how they set up their own portfolio value creation teams and got an opportunity to do just that in a small mid-market fund in the US. So for a while I left and became a private equity operating partner on a number of portfolio companies, but sort of quite rapidly becoming a real operator for a while. I joke that it's the only real job I've ever done in my life, but I was seconded onto one of our businesses as a chief commercial officer and got to sort of see the real nitty gritty. And it was a huge learning experience for me. I think it has made me a much stronger advisor because I learned in that the realities of how to make growth happen on the ground, how to make change happen on the ground that are very different than the somewhat academic lens that consultants can sometimes take on things where, you see that the world as a spreadsheet and you think to yourself, hey, I'll add 10 more salespeople here. And if they're effective, then I'll grow. And you think, well, that's not quite what it looks like on the ground.
What advice would you give anyone now or give yourself if you could turn back the clock and making that transition from consulting into private equity now? What advice would you give anyone thinking about making that move into a similar role?
I mean, I think it is a great type of role to do. I think it is a great opportunity to make. I think I probably should have made it earlier in my career. I think I started to develop a little bit of senioritis already by the time I left Bain, and I think it is the transition back to the coalface, and it's a lot less supported as a role, and so you are doing your own analysis. You're back to the Excel, you're back to the PowerPoint, and that was probably a tougher transition than it would have been if I'd made that move 5 to 10 years earlier in my career. But I think it is a great way of continuing to build on the skills that you learn as a consultant, but to take those into a real world application.
And what was interesting is that you went straight from consulting into that role. You didn't have any real world experience.
Exactly. I still barely have any real world experience. A harder transition, but it was one that was, I think it was a very good way of doing it.
And then you decided it wasn't for you, or?
And then I decided it wasn't for me, exactly. No, then two things happened really for me. One was I realized when I got close to the coalface that while I liked the detail, what I really missed was the pure focus on strategy, and I missed the ability to work on lots of different topics that were always the most important topic for my clients. And so when you're chief commercial officer of a small regional business, you're worrying day to day much more about individual customers, about production quotas, about sales concerns, and you're worrying a lot less about the big picture strategy stuff, which was really why I had gone into consulting in the first place and what I had loved about the job. And the other thing I missed was the teams. I mean, for me, the most rewarding thing about my job continues to be the people I get to work with, and that is both my clients, but it's also the teams on the ground, and it's the problem solving as a group. It's the ability to learn from other people on an ongoing basis that really energizes me, and you get that much more, I think, in consulting than you do in deep operations, where you, by nature, end up being a little bit more independent. This was also at a time when COVID was hitting, and I'd been spending 5 days a week on the road. My wife was pregnant with our first child, and it was felt like a very good opportunity to transition back into something that was a little bit less travel and a little bit more comfortable.
Which sounds unusual for a consulting job, but that's exactly what you've got.
Well, that is the beauty of doing the type of consulting that I do, and to some degree the type of consulting that OC&C does relative to the type of consulting that I've been exposed to earlier in my career. Is we're not really on the ground at the client site 4 days a week type of people. It's not the type of projects we do. Private equity by nature is a lot less travel, and so it tends to be a little bit more office-based.
As it's noted here, you're global head of OC&C's private equity practice. And you co-lead the firm's B2B practice as well in the US, as well as serving as an elected member of the global board, which is fantastic. Tell us a bit about that and what that encompasses.
OC&C is a pure play strategy firm. We've been around for 35 years. The genesis of the firm was very much out of the UK. It's one of the things that drew it to me as an expat Brit. I'd actually applied to OC&C coming out of undergrad in, I think, 2003, not to age myself, and been firmly rejected by them at the time. Finally, they accepted me. We primarily do two things. We do strategy and we do diligence. And about 50% of our work is in the private equity community. About 50% of our work is in the corporate world. And when we say strategy, we mean strategy. And that is, I think, we don't do what I became used to at Bain, which is sort of year-long transformation programs, lots of in-depth things like operational improvements and cost reduction. We are much more focused on quick C-suite level, high-level strategy work that then bridges very nicely into the type of problems you're trying to solve when you're doing commercial due diligence for private equity clients, and you're doing strategy for private equity clients too, who are trying to be targeted. They're trying to be focused on what are the key levers I can pull that will really drive value. And they're trying to do that with a view of who do I want to be when I grow up in the business. And that's always been our strength. And the way we organize and have always organized is much more by sector vertical than it is by horizontal capability. So we are fundamentally sector experts or sector specialists, all of whom do both strategy and diligence. We don't have a private equity ring fence like a Bain does.
Yeah.
All do. The people who work with our corporate clients on their most important questions are the same people who are then evaluating businesses for private equity or working with our private equity businesses. So what does that mean for my role as the horizontal leader in a world that is more vertically specialized? Really, it's a role of coordination and just making sure that across these sectors, private equity is one community. Private equity doesn't always arrange itself in the way that we might arrange ourselves. And so we are all talking to fundamentally the same people. We're all trying to drive to the same goals with our clients. And a lot of my role is making sure that we are doing that in a coordinated way, both at account levels. So we're talking to, when we're talking to the same people, we know what the other hand is doing, but also at a product execution level, thinking about what are the types of projects we can be doing more with our clients. How can we be better improving the way that we do diligence, the tools that we use in diligence, and the way that we serve the private equity community in as helpful a way as possible? Because I think we've been emerging. I think we've been arguably for 20, 30 years, and if you sort of take the European view, but certainly in the US, I think we've got a really strong growing position as one of the leading, certainly boutique providers of strategic advice into private equity. And I think that is it's always fun. One of the things that drew me to coming back to consulting at OC&C is it's always fun to be a challenger brand. But I think the type of work that we do, the quality of the work that we do, and the breadth of coverage that we will offer to private equity from kind of diligence through to value creation, through to exit planning and sell side, I think has really resonated with the market. And so that has been a lot of my focus is how do we evangelize that gospel? How do we get in front of more private equity clients? How do we continue to maintain the strength of that proposition?
Great. Well, listen, let's move on, because really what I want to do is pick your brains on Superreturn. As our eyes and ears on the ground, as our intrepid reporter, keen to get your view on what you took away from that. I mean, you were in Berlin last week. What were your observations from that? What were some of your key takeaways? Did you come away positive, optimistic? Did you come away deflated? How was the whole experience? Was this the first time you've been, or you've been before?
This was my first time at Superreturns, which was a really fascinating experience. It was incredibly well attended, up and down, both in terms of representation of firms, but also if you just look at the quality of speakers and the quality of individuals who attended and the quality of the dialogue. Broadly characterized the mood as one of cautious optimism.
Okay.
It's been a challenging couple of years for private equity and certainly not private equity writ large, but as an industry, I think you can paint a picture of a significant investment boom in the sort of 2019 to 21 period. Certainly 2021 was incredibly busy. And that was playing into a low interest rate environment with a lot of dry powder and a significant growth trajectory on businesses that were being bought. And so people were coming in at buying things at a very high price, but they had low cost of debt to do it, and they had high expectations of growth trajectory. I think what we've seen in the 2 to 3 years since then is increasing macroeconomic uncertainty, whether it's coming from the Ukraine crisis in Europe, strong inflationary pressure in the US, now obviously the noise that's coming from tariffs and other global questions has put a little bit of a dent in some of those growth plans. It has driven up in interest rates. So now suddenly interest rates are much higher. So the cost of borrowing is going to be higher for the next buyers. And it has somewhat stalled activity for the last 18, 24 months. So we're seeing a lot less exits, in part because the IPO channel has dried up. And we're seeing nervous LPs now worried about their DPI and the return to capital that they're getting, and that's driving a little bit of growth in the secondaries market. It's driving a slight shift, although I don't know that the data really plays this out, but a slight shift into credit, which obviously with high interest rates is a much more exciting space to be. It's gotten everyone a little bit cautious about their ability to do deals, both to exit existing businesses that aren't doing as well as you thought they were, and where you bought them at such a high price that you need to get a high price at exit, but then also some nervousness around the ability to put capital to work, which you always get in private equity because there's always funds that were raised 5 years earlier and are looking at their investment cycle and the expectations of drawdown from LPs and the need to put capital to work. The optimism side of it is certainly there are pockets that remain exciting, and debt was a big topic that came up. The expectation is the market will work itself out. Yes, we're in a position right now where DPI is a challenge where exits aren't coming, but there are so many assets out there that just fundamentally will need to be exited. The money needs to go back to LPs. There's more money coming in at the top end that needs to get deployed. Yes, there's been uncertainty. That uncertainty is now becoming clarity around the uncertainty, which I realize is a slightly weird distinction. But I think once you know there's going to be uncertainty, you can almost plan for uncertainty. It's giving people a path to getting comfort around new deals before super returns. And it's true of my general conversations in the market. There is a growing expectation for deal volume acceleration. If it's in 1 quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, but it's not in 2 years, that the dam's going to break, and at some point the volumes are going to start to increase a lot again, and deals are going to get made. And so that's the sort of short term, look, this will work itself out optimism. It's almost a kind of, hey, look, we've seen this picture before. Yes, it's a little bit struggling right now, but we think we'll get through it. I think that was coupled with some really interesting data brought by people and just general commentary around a firm belief that private equity is still one of the best, if not the best way to fund and hold businesses in the market, right? Particularly in the middle market. 5-year returns, 10-year returns, 15-year returns, they still outpace public markets. The value that you can drive as a private equity-backed business is higher than it is in public markets. You are taken away from the short-term quarterly earnings cycle and need to please a market that is looking at very recent data and very short-term data. You're giving yourself access to patient capital that can transform businesses and drive value over a longer horizon. And so I think, unsurprisingly, the delegates and the speakers were unapologetic in their support of private equity as an asset class and continue to believe that it will be a big driver and it will continue to be a strong asset class. There's a point of view that I am buoyed by, but also firmly believe in.
Good. You and I both. So was there one piece of insight or one prediction about the private equity market that dominated discussions there?
2 big ones were partly this debt question, but also just it's my first time in super returns, but it's not my first time in this industry. So some of these feel like messages that we've heard over and over again. But I think it only becomes more and more important in an environment like this to do good deals and do them well. And what that means and what a lot of the conversation was about was really continued importance of value creation and operational improvement plans and the ability to not just be a passive investor, but take businesses and transform them and drive growth in a way that others can't, and to have a proprietary view, particularly in auction markets, that you have a proprietary view on the type of value you can generate with a business that allows you to bid up with confidence, that allows you to go after assets in a way that maybe your competing funds won't be able to do. So that's the kind of own well and drive value well. And I think the other flip side of that, the importance of sourcing and finding companies, being able to do that in a thematic way, being able to do that hopefully in a proprietary way. All of these things are driving, I think, continued need for specialization, for skills, for capabilities in private equity houses that can really make the difference. We are past the world of financial engineering allowing you to make money in private equity. The first decade of private equity where it was just all about the LBO, it was all about the debt, and then the own the asset, hold the asset, make a ton of money. That's not possible anymore. Debt's become smarter. Prices have gone up. Auctions are more competitive. You can't just be a buy and hold anymore. You've got to transform the businesses. You've got to add value to them. When
we talk about sort of private equity firms adapting their strategies, is this one of the key things that you've seen at Super Returns, and this is what you've been advising your clients around?
Yeah, I think, and that has been the big sea change certainly since I started this career, has been the growth of value creation teams in private equity. Obviously, I'm a good example of that. And the constant evolution of those teams, right? I think that the struggle here is there is no one right model. And a lot of people have gone through many models until they found the one that works for them. There are funds that do this incredibly well. Bain Capital is an obvious early example of a fund that figured out how to do these operational changes, built a portfolio value creation team, figured out the internal mechanics of how do you pass the deal over to the value creation team, share ownership with the deal team. The Bain Capital model would not work for a large number of funds out there. The culture doesn't work with it, the individuals wouldn't work with it, and the types of investments they're making aren't suited to it. And so everyone has to find the model that fits them, and it is a stop-start process, I would say, and I'm sure you've seen this too, right?
Yeah.
The groups that get stood up and then get stood down again, and then another slightly different group gets stood up, and you go between, do you want generalists, do you want specialists, do you want ex-operators, or do you want ex-advisors, do you want young hungry, or do you want old wizened? And I don't know that there is an answer for that.
There isn't. I mean, this is a daily conversation we have with every private equity fund, and a lot of it is predicated on the investments they're making and the companies within their portfolio and their needs, and I guess, the strategic challenges that they're facing. So there isn't one answer that would fit the whole industry. But we'll come on to that because I'm keen to discuss how you've seen talent evolve, I guess, in that regard as well, especially within that value creation world. So again, thinking about Superreturn, but now talking about the US, how has the private equity landscape in the US evolved over the past couple of years? If I link in that, what we touched upon, how do you think recent tariff policies under Trump is affecting the PE market in the US as well?
Yeah, it's a good question. And some of what I talked about around deal stagnation, struggling environment, I think has held true in the US. I think what's happened is there's been, certainly over the last 2 years, there's been a flight to quality is probably the wrong word, but there have just been sectors that have been a little bit more resilient or seen as a little bit more attractive, or most importantly, have significant secular tailwinds behind them that has driven up demand and has where you've seen a real resurgence in deal activity, and a lot of money has flooded into those. And from anything infrastructure related, anything that was taking advantage of the Infrastructure Investment in Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, where you suddenly had firm funding tailwinds into markets like engineering, like infrastructure services, both transportation, water, power, and you have an industry that is ripe somewhat for private equity consolidation and professionalization. It has been very busy. So there are pockets that have been incredibly busy. I think there are pockets in sort of more traditional consumer markets. There are pockets in some tech areas that have been very, very quiet, where there's more uncertainty that's driving a lot more caution, and some of that uncertainty is macroeconomic. Some of that uncertainty is around the rise of AI and how that changes who wins and who loses in those landscapes, and that has caused GPs to be a little bit more cautious in those markets. That turning of the corner is becoming a little bit apparent here as well. I think in the US we're seeing more green shoots across the board. The tariff question, which has of course been the core part of any diligence anyone has looked at. Some industries are pretty protected from tariffs. And so again, you are seeing more activity and more certainty around industries that are service industry businesses that are not exposed to as complex international and global supply chains. And even then, the impact of tariffs has become a core question on how does it change the underlying macroeconomics of the industry? How does it affect? Because even if it doesn't affect the businesses directly, it affects their customers, and therefore it affects the ongoing demand for their services. And I think it has caused a pause, and it has caused a lot of things. And we've seen live deals that have gone silent specifically for this reason, as people try to figure out what the end result looks like. And I think the struggle that has really driven it is, if it's one thing if you say, hey, we've got a shift in policy, this is now the tariff policy, then you can adapt to that. You can work out how it's going to impact things, you can calculate it, and you can say, okay, there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers, and I can plan that out. I think what's really happened is nobody knows what the tariff policy is going to be in tomorrow, right? We could wake up to a tweet that changes everything, and so there's just turbulence. And in a world of turbulence, I think there was a few months of a real hope for stability and a hope for kind of, hey, this will wash out and then we'll know the answer. Yeah. I think we're probably all coming to terms now with the fact that uncertainty will continue for longer, and now people are shifting instead to how can we plan for uncertainty, and both how can we look for investments where we can protect ourselves against uncertainty, and then in our portfolio companies, how can we strengthen our supply chain? How can we mitigate against future impact of tariff changes, knowing that they could change any minute?
So based on that and on the back of that, what sectors are you currently seeing as being the most attractive for private equity investment right now? And what are the challenges with investing in these sectors?
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about infrastructure services, things that are taking advantage of the tailwinds around energy transition, the tailwinds around AI, and I don't necessarily mean tech companies here, but I mean AI driving up a huge demand for data centers. That is driving up a lot of demand for businesses that serve data centers, both in the construction phase and in the ongoing management phase. But from my perspective is where we're seeing a lot of activity. Great opportunities for investments, in part because they are nascent industries. They've been traditionally quite fragmented. So we're seeing some real success early on here of private equity businesses buying platforms and rapidly accelerating their growth, taking share, doing a series of bolt-on M&A acquisitions in a playbook that's been done in other sectors in the past. I think some of the challenge is still around managing the exact level of uncertainty. And then I think there's an element of, again, with any nascent industry or any large point of inflection, it's not always clear who the winners and losers are going to be. You have to be confident that you're backing a business that's well positioned for future trends, but you also have to be confident that you are backing a management team and that you yourself have the capability to ride the waves as they come and be able to adapt and change and take advantage of opportunities as they arise, because it is a harder to predict long-term view. These are growth markets, not stable markets. Growth markets will always see competitive shakeouts.
How do you see technology and I guess AI impacting the future of private equity? I mean, when you say you can't predict, isn't there an argument to suggest that actually AI can?
I don't think AI today can predict winners and losers. I think AI, as it stands today, is an incredibly valuable productivity tool, and it will transform many industries, and it will hugely transform some, and it will cause the demise of some. Candidly, it will change who wins and who loses in others, where it's who can adapt the most to AI, who can use this productivity tool. I think there's an element of truth to that in my own industry. Consulting from a productivity level, I think, is absolutely going to be affected. I think there is no question in my mind that the way that we do the job is rapidly changing with the advent of AI. Hey, can I just replace my OC&C study with, I'll ask ChatGPT? I don't think we're there yet. I think there's still a real importance of the human in the loop in that story. I think the reasoning, the history, the human overlay that comes from experience that isn't just data extrapolation, I think will continue to be critical.
There's talk today that actually everything you get from ChatGPT isn't necessarily accurate.
I mean, the hallucinations are huge. The ability of the tool to reason has been, when we have tested it in our applications, has probably been not as strong as we would like it to be, which means it is a very, very powerful tool for research. It's a very powerful tool for extracting information from vast amounts of data. The reasoning skills are by nature not there, and the auditability of the reasoning skills are definitely not there. Someone gave me the analogy the other day, which is a very helpful one, which is if you ask an analyst to go find something out and they come back and they give you an answer, and then you say, great, and you say, well, how did you come up with that answer? And they'll take you through exactly every step that they took, and you can then audit it and say, well, I'm not sure if that assumption or that data source was right. If you ask ChatGPT for an answer, it'll give you an answer, and it may give you an answer that looks just as good as the answer that the analyst gave you. If you ask it how it came up with the answer, it will give you a probabilistic answer for what it thinks the answer is to the question of how did I come up with the answer. It's not actually going to give you how it came up with the answer. Like, it has no understanding of its own processes. It is a probability-based model that when you ask it to self-reason, it just gives you the probability answer to the self-reasoning question, not the actual self-reasoning question. That is, I mean, in my personal use, in other use, the level of hallucinations that you see is still relatively high. Now, I think that will rapidly decrease, and I think the growth of agentic AI is going to drive with AIs that are much more task-specific oriented and therefore can be trained to lose hallucinations over time, and better prompt engineering around that. I think all of that will improve it, but it's still not going to solve for the perfect reasoning, and it's still not going to give you exactly as you say, the confidence that you get from the human factor of expertise, experience, depth of kind of how many times have we done this before, how many times have we seen this before. That doesn't change the fact that it dramatically changes the process that we go through and the nature of the job, particularly at the junior levels. And it takes away a lot of the boring rote stuff that most people don't like to do, can automate a lot of that, and it probably shifts the balance of workload from answer generation and research generation to pressure testing and dissemination. In the past, you'd send the analyst out to do a bunch of research, make some slides, come back with an answer, and then there'd be a little bit of back and forth on, is this the right answer? Let's make sure it makes sense, and let's make sure it's a story that seems coherent. I think that first task is going to be a lot quicker, but that's going to push the need to spend more time on that second task. So yes, research time will drop, but then error checking and pressure testing is going to increase. And more fundamentally, and I'm old enough that I've seen a lot of this in the past, productivity improvements have been multiple in consulting over the last 30, 40 years. I'm not quite old enough to say I started in a world where we didn't have Excel, but I certainly started in a world where we didn't have expert networks, for example. So you sort of think about primary research. It was a good project if you could get 10 calls in 3 weeks because you were sort of cold calling people to try to get answers. Suddenly the expert networks come in, and now we're driving 50 to 100 calls in a 2-week period, and we're getting a huge amount of increased insight out of that. Data availability has grown over time. Everything has made the ability to drive value so much higher, but the answer has not been great, so we'll do a shorter project. The answer has been great. So, when I did my first diligences 20 years ago, they were a 50-page report with some interesting data and the key data in there, of course, but those 50 pages of analysis come out of over 3 weeks. Now my teams are doing 200, 250 pages of real in-depth analysis with insight coming out of a much vaster trove of information that they can then process a lot faster and generate a lot more insight out of. And I think that is probably, the optimist's view is that's what's going to happen to us under ChatGPT. We're going to see a huge growth in productivity, maybe at the margin, a change in ultimate pyramid shape, but you cannot take away the apprenticeship model out of consulting. It's critical because even if you said I could automate everything that my first and second year analysts do, well, great, but I still need the third year analyst and the consultant and the manager and the associate partner. I still need people who have learned how it all works and can come up and can ultimately replace me. Then maybe that changes then the sort of way you think about junior resources. Maybe it becomes more of a shadowing and apprenticeship role and less of an active doing role.
With the changes that we're seeing from a technology point of view, with the impact that we're seeing, not just from Trump's tariffs, but the geopolitical situation across the world now. And I guess your experience of not only operating yourself as an operating partner, but working with value creation teams, how are you seeing the capability requirements change within private equity funds, the skills needed to help funds and portfolio companies navigate their way through all of this right now? How have you seen that adapt over the last 12 months? And how can you see the change going forward that's going to be required?
12 months is always hard to see a pattern, right? I think it's probably more like a sort of 10-year trend that kind of goes through waves. And I think as we talked about, different funds will have different approaches, and I am still not sold that there's a perfect answer, because I think it's always a situational answer. But I certainly think over the last 5 years, the growth in specialization has been significant in terms of the portfolio groups are looking for. I think if you wind the clock back 15 years, even arguably if you wind the clock back to when I started that job, it was a generalist's job, right? As was consulting when I started consulting. I want a smart person who can look at my portfolio and think about how to add value and maybe bring in some expertise, but ultimately I just need smart people and they'll figure it out. I think as those groups have matured, just as consulting matured over time, they have realized that actually specialization is critical. You want someone who knows how to do talent management. You want someone who knows how to work with Office of the CFO, someone who understands supply chain. You want someone who understands pricing. And there is much more value in specialized tools and scalpels that you can send in to really drive specific programs at your portfolio companies, more than a bunch of consulting trained generalists running around sort of trying to run mini consulting projects in the portfolio. But sometimes the answer is both, right? Sometimes the answer is, hey, it's important to have the generalists because the generalists can take the aggregated view. They can help with the prioritization. They can help identify what the right things are to be driving and then program manage those. But you also critically need access to specialization. And sometimes that access in some choices, that access comes from a deep bench of advisors, a deep bench of not employees, but people who you can bring in on a consulting basis. Sometimes it comes through access to specialized consulting firms. But often, and particularly at scale private equity businesses, it is coming from individuals with expertise that can sit across portfolio companies.
That's a great note to finish on. Carl, it's been great talking to you today. Really appreciate the time. You and I have known each other a long time, as I said, and it's been great to get your insight, certainly on the Superreturn event that happened last week as well. So thank you for sharing that with us, and good to see you today. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Good.